Yeah, no, absolutely. We are in a historic moment. It's, this is for antitrust, for anti-monopoly, for pro-democracy, for, just fighting concentrated private power. This is the most important time since 1912, 1913, in terms of the conversation, in terms of changing people's understanding of what the problem is and what we can do about it. And so it's fantastically exciting.
You bring up time, and of course it's a zeitgeist time where you have issues that are finally getting attention, sometimes earlier in some jurisdictions, sometimes later. It is different methods. One of the things we're trying to get ahead of a little bit is the anti-competitive practices that are threatening our rights, our democracy, our free market economies, our basic principles of life. But before this, we've only been able to address these, if at all, in other sectors, through essentially litigation. And litigation takes time, it takes resources, it tends to only have a binary result. And so I'm very much in favor of those routes which are taking a more holistic approach. They're looking at privacy rights, they're looking at other kinds of rights that are important. And I think for that you need a multiple set of arrows in your quiver, if you will. And so I wouldn't be in favor of just relying on one big case, say in one big jurisdiction, but something more involved.
And you say that because, as we're recording, there is one big case that everyone's talking about. This question about the broader agenda. We've just had the speech of the President of the European Commission, and there wasn't a moment in that speech where she set out several horsepersons of a digital apocalypse. Collapse of journalism, problems in labor with people working for algorithms more and more, the carbon costs of the processing that may not need to be happening, problems for elections, all of these things. We're at this historic moment where everyone knows we need to do something on both sides of the Atlantic. There's just one little thing missing, I think, and that is that there isn't, from the very top, from the person in their job interview moment for the next commission, saying, here's the agenda, here's how we're going to crack it. Maybe that's unfair.
I think it's very easy for politicians, especially on a platform or even when they're implementing policies, to say we're pro-growth, we're pro-innovation, we're pro-business, we're pro-consumer rights, we're pro. I'm pro-apple pie, I'm pro-motherhood, I'm pro-fairness, like that. But how do you implement it, like that? And sometimes some of these issues cut across each other. I don't think they do as much as the actual policies and how they're implemented can cut across each other. But I think there's no question that it's not difficult for everybody to agree that we're pro these things and we're anti certain things, but what are we going to do about it?
There was something else that was important in von der Leyen's speech, which is her comments about China, which is another monopoly problem. We tend to look at the monopoly problem as one of big tech. And that's absolutely, it's an absolutely huge threat to our democracy. But there is another threat to our democracy, another threat to our security, which is this extreme concentration of capacity, monopolization of control over industrial capacity that we see in China and a couple other places. We see it in Taiwan, we see it in some of it in Japan and Korea. And this is something that this has been emerging actually for longer than the big tech problem. And one of the things that was really remarkable about President von der Leyen's speech was actually making the comments that she did, sort of challenge, saying that this is a problem and implying the potential use of tools that haven't been used in a long time, like tariffs, to start dealing with it.
I historically have been a skeptic of trade policy getting involved in this area at all, either because I think they'll just promote their own business's interests, because that's what I view most trade diplomats as, is they're just trying to flog their own company's stuff, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But on the other hand, I worry about a dilution of that floor in some ways through multilateral negotiations. To get everybody the same place, you might get everybody agreeing, yeah, we should do something, or let's have more transparency. But what does that mean? So I worry a little bit about this, but I'm amazed that the U.S. Trade Representative has come out with this, and I'd love to know more about it.
Yeah, and your concerns are absolutely valid. What we've seen over the last 20 years is the trade ministers getting involved in these questions in ways that disrupt the domestic conversations about controlling and regulating power. And so actually bringing these two conversations together it's not what we're seeing that's different this time is that rather than the trade conversation interfering in domestic conversations about how to regulate big tech, how to regulate concentration in key industrial systems, it's the other way around. It's actually the conversation that's taking place in the competition policy sphere is now influencing the trade sphere. And this is actually going to help the trade ministers, the trade ambassadors to sort of update their thinking about what presents a problem, what is a crisis that we must address. And so it's the revolution that's taking place in domestic competition policy that's now traveling into the international sphere.
And here in Europe, maybe there's more reasons to be optimistic as well. You know, if about 2 weeks ago we had this report from the European Commission, and it came out under the auspices of the Digital Services Act. I was talking about this yesterday. And what's significant about that report is it said all of the tech platforms today have failed, in this case against Russian disinformation, have failed to act in a way that they would be required to under the law. And the Commission released that before the law is applicable, which is a sign that they expect companies to actually do something. Now, I don't remember hearing anything like that before in the digital space, where they say, you've already failed the law that's about to apply to you tomorrow. That's a big statement. And the other reason for some optimism is, we had Rita from the Commission, and she was asked the question, maybe by you, do you have enough engineers? She said, we have a lot of engineers now on our team, and our engineers are the ones who interrogate the company's engineers. Now, you have a question about which engineers and do they have the right competence, but that's a space we haven't been in before. So we may be about to start on this side of the Atlantic. It feels like the beginnings, rather than being in the middle, but it feels like we're finally, we've got the foundations.
I think we're fully through the first stage in some ways. I think DMA, DSA, Data Act, these cases that have been brought and are being brought in the United States. This is, we've reached, in this a different plateau, and we should recognize the fact that we're at a different plateau. And we should be proud of what we've achieved, because we went from 0 to 60. In pretty rapidly. But what we also have to make sure we don't do is pat ourselves on the back too much.
Because the other guys are going at 120.
Yeah, we're still catching up
for the last 10 years.
So they've extended their lead on us during this period, but we are accelerating faster than they are. But we just had to keep going. We have to go to stage 2. We have to go to stage 3. We got to keep our foot on the accelerator.
And what I think some of the initiatives that are aimed at a regulatory intervention are ones that are saying, we're not trying to pick winners. We're not trying to destroy these monopolies, though others may. We're saying we recognize that they've provided a great deal of quite convenient things, but I think human rights and other rights are a bit more important than convenience. They've trained us to be rationally lazy, so we don't even switch with our thumb very much, when we could very easily. But one of the concerns I have is this idea that are we still going to spend so much time learning and learning, even learning by doing, without actually grasping the nettle?
That's what the interim measures are for in the DMA. And I can't remember, is it 6 months or 3 months? As soon as the rules are applicable, if it's a crisis, and if we're not in a crisis, what's a crisis? You can apply interim measures. So this will sound unfair, but I feel like we should almost have tripwires for enforcement. If we were to look back at DMA enforcement in 5 years, and if it looked to us like something like GDPR enforcement, in other words, an unmitigated disaster. If we look back and think, what could we have done as bystanders or assistants from the sidelines, I think we would have wanted to put in tripwires that said, if this kind of thing hasn't happened within 6 months or within 9 months or 12 months, we should be alarmed and say that's a bit of a yellow card, and after another 3 months a red card.
And I think one of the ways to actually create these tripwires, one of the ways to understand what are the tripwires we want to establish, is to understand what the actual threat is and sort of create a sense of what is the hierarchy of threats that we are dealing with, because we're dealing with a vast suite of threats. Some of them are economic, but a lot of them are political. And so, we have to understand, it's very important that we focus foremost on threats to our ability to communicate with each other, threats to the press, threats of disinformation, the manipulation of debate on platforms, because to the extent we allow massively powerful corporations to interfere with how we communicate with each other, to deprive us of our ability to rely on well-edited, well-reported news and share that news with one another. If we allow that to stand, none of the rest of it becomes possible to achieve because we lose our ability to communicate with each other. So to create these tripwires, we have to actually, create a hierarchy. We need to address threats to communications foremost, other threats to democracy and human liberty, and then, somewhere down the way are things like technological innovation. Enormously important technological innovation.
The example I have in my mind is, you can look at some of the litigation we've seen in the US and some of the discoveries that's come out of that, and we can look at what is happening inside Meta from one very specific case. We're both thinking about the same case. And you can say, we're pretty sure it's the same processing on both sides of the Atlantic, and it definitely infringes existing law, data protection law, but it also infringes the new provisions in Article 5 in particular. So unless something very structural has changed inside that company, it will definitely be infringing. So the Commission does not have to start from zero and do an investigation from the ground and say, let's gather these facts. Unfortunately for US litigators, they've already spent 4 years doing that. So they can, in some of these cases, take what appear to be facts.
Yep.
Now, I know that has to be tested, but they can take what appear to be facts, confront a gatekeeper with those facts and say, we're almost certain you're infringing today. And either you prove to us that you fix this, or you get interim measures. And they say that on day one.
And we get to the proof point then. Is the proof going to be a glossy compliance report prepared by Google's policy group or whatever, very shiny, lots of stats? Or for that proof, do we need technologists, engineers, data scientists in these entities, in these government entities, whatever, who can actually help test that? Or were you just relying on third-party complainants to test those promises, those compliance?
The Commission
pamphlets?
is saying that it has that capacity now, and that it's growing it. So hopefully that is not a question. Hopefully. Now, we might look back in 5 years and think maybe it was, but hopefully not. It might be worth thinking about what failure looks like. One of the questions that came up in our conversations was what happens if the US administration changes? And, there's a question about whether the momentum that's been built up will continue. And there's also a question for Europe. Europe has now made yet another set of promises on digital. And it feels like there's a risk that it lays down another layer of sedimentary law, silts down to the bottom of the tank, and it just sits there along with Europe's credibility. So for Europe, is it going to be a force in the world is actually one big question. If we cannot do what we say we're going to do. And for the US, there's all of this energy has been building up over years. Is it unstoppable depending on a political change, or is it part of Trump's agenda if he gets in as well, in a way?
Well, actually, we should remember that the case that just began last week in Washington was a case that was filed by Trump's Department of Justice. So, there's this sense that the Trump administration was entirely chaotic, that it was, backward-looking, that it was, in support of large corporations, and to a certain extent that is true, but when it comes to the tech corporations, no, there's actually a huge amount of distrust, and there's actually a body of work that they put together demonstrating that they're relatively serious about this issue. So we should also remember the case that followed that. The second DOJ case against Google came out of a very Republican administration in Texas. It originated at a state-level AG, Attorney General, in the state of Texas, and that has now been sort of federalized by the Democratic-appointed AAG, Jonathan Cantor. So the idea that Republicans and Democrats, or that Republicans are going to sabotage what Democrats are doing, is not defensible based on existing fact, let alone speculation about the future.
One of the things I'm concerned about is this is a great populist movement, as we know, for a lot of this intervention or pro-competitive regulation or cases, and I applaud that. It's led into fantastic political appointments of great leaders of agencies around the world. What I'm worried a little bit about is that the voters, the citizens, the users, the people, the human beings, what will they take from the interventions? For example, a lot of the tech giants will say, oh, well, you'll have to pay more for your delivery charges, or you won't be able to do this, and here's all these horror stories that you won't be able to do. And is it remotely likely that the consumers who rightly don't know about all of this stuff, they just find it annoying when something happens or doesn't?
Well, there's been a lot of polling in the United States on this issue, and one of the things that we've seen is that the people, they generally have pretty positive feelings as consumers towards a lot of the big tech companies, towards Amazon, towards Google, towards Facebook. Facebook's actually a somewhat lower approval. But people are not dumb. They're not only consumers. People are also very sophisticated politically, and the numbers that came out before the last election were shocking. It was like 80 to 85% of Americans across the board, independents, Democrats, Republicans, were afraid of the political power and sort of political manipulation by big tech. So in the United States, where we've done this work, it is just overwhelming fear of the political power of the companies, often combined with, well, I'm just going to keep using Amazon because it's convenient. And you can't, I think that's that's actually the logical conclusion for the average person to reach. I want the government to do something about this, but I'm going to keep using it meanwhile.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's a question about whether convenience automatically goes away. When enforcement walks into the room, do we suddenly lose all convenience? I think we might if the companies maliciously comply, which is entirely possible.
The friction.
We have been taught, they've told us time and again, compliance will lead to higher prices and it will lead to less convenience. And actually, what we've seen from the past, from every major antitrust enforcement action in the past, is lower prices, more convenience, more innovation. So there's, on the economic side, the material side, there's almost no real loss, certainly in the midterm and long term.
But you see Meta, or you see other companies, you see Elon, I'm going to turn off Starlink. I'm going to cut off news and messenger services in Australia and in Canada, which also includes a lot of emergency services and these kinds of things. And that might have been the case years ago with very particularly small jurisdictions where in a merger environment they might say, well, we're not getting a good result from that competition agency in Israel or Guernsey or whatever, so we'll just carve out the completion from there, right? But here what I'm concerned about is they can actually do these things with a number of switches, but they're sophisticated enough to know that they shouldn't turn off the stuff that will turn the community against them, like that, but they still do it. And it can't be the case that they're not sophisticated enough to know that. And so are these conscious decisions to try to say, yeah, we're not only going to turn off your media, we're also going to turn off your emergency services, or do you think they're actually just, they don't care, or they...
Isn't this just terrible hubris?
Yes, hubris.
But until people push back, they're going to keep doing it. I mean, we should remember, it's like what you see with, say, Orban and or just autocrats in countries around the world, is they will hit and they will push and they will suppress to the point at which there is reaction. And the same is true absolutely for the autocrats within the private sector. People who have concentrated in such enormous power that we see in corporations like Google, in Facebook, in Amazon, in Twitter, which is a smaller enterprise, but it has real power over the people that use it. And so the autocratic mind is not limited to people who are in charge of states. It is very much alive among people who are in charge of the corporate estate. And that's what we're dealing with here. And until people fight back, they're going to keep, these folks, they're going to keep shutting off the news. They're going to keep shutting off individuals they don't like. They're going to keep shutting off companies that they don't like. That's the way autocrats operate.
Or, as you say, just to allow disinformation to proliferate so it drowns out the other democratic voices there, or makes them look odd. I mean, I know we're lumping a lot of companies, these big tech companies, into one batch, and we all know that they have slightly different business models and different ways of working. Advertising is a big funder of a lot of this. Sometimes advertising isn't the main thing, but the monetary objective, follow the money. The monetary objective seems to be driving most of this and reducing down some of the other concerns. You know, I've heard that in some companies, some of the young ones enter the company and they go, "Oh my God, what have I done?" And then they come over and join an NGO or something like that.
Ad tech remorse.
Ad tech remorse. I love it. But are there any examples you've seen of any of these entities, the big ones we've been talking about, getting it and saying, you know what, it might cost us something, but you know, even if they make the decision, we'll just stop doing this bad thing that they say is bad because we don't want to litigate it and we don't want the distraction, or we want it for good PR. Are there any examples where they've done anything that you say, maybe they are getting it? Or is it still just shouting into the wind?
Microsoft, in the 10, 12 years, 14 years after the case, the antitrust case against them, acted in a different way than the other corporations. A few years back, however, Microsoft decided, well, gosh, look at the way in which Google is operating. If we adopt those practices, we can make more money. And so there was a decision that Microsoft made about 4, 5, 6 years ago to adopt the same bad actions, the same, that the other corporations are using. So that was, so we saw that an alternative approach is possible. We can see that you can make a lot of money while trying to avoid some of the most egregious actions. So it's possible. Right now, we don't see any leading corporations.
There's some straw men out there that have been thrown around. I remember an FTC commissioner, a Republican, Christine Wilson, saying, "Be careful what you wish for. What you guys are talking about in terms of this pro-competitive ex-ante regulation and rulemaking sounds a lot like what happened with the railways, and sounds like a lot that happened in other areas that can be very unhelpful to business. It can just create these gigantic bureaucracies," these kinds of arguments. I refer to them obviously as straw men because they're very easy to shut down like that in many ways. But do you think that's a real concern, that we're going to over-regulate, that we're going to actually harm genuinely good business models? Or at the other end of the spectrum, are we really only going to polish things at the margin? Yeah. And if we want to do something in the middle, what's the jugular? What can we get? Is it their money? It is what do we try to, and that's, I'm not leading towards taxation, I'm leading towards how can we actually affect change?
I mean, I think that's an enormously important question, and it actually cuts right at one of the core debates that's taking place in competition policy right now, which is, do you regulate sort of after the fact, or do you regulate before? Do you establish simple rules of behavior and simple market structures beforehand? Or do you just do this on a case-by-case basis, as Christine Wilson was suggesting? Liberalism is based on rule of law. Liberalism is based on simple rules of market structure, on simple rules about behavior. Because if you have a simple rule of law that is enforced fairly across the board, that's a form of freedom for the business. It's, you're guaranteeing a kind of liberty for everybody in society, but you're also delivering a kind of liberty for the business person, for the investor, because you know exactly where the wall is. And therefore, when you know where the wall is, you steer away from the wall and you put your attention on things that you know are clearly legal. So ex-ante regulation, the establishment of clear law, and the enforcement across the board of this law is how we deliver freedom to the business person and the investor. One is, ordoliberalism is in many ways an outgrowth of sort of Jeffersonian, Brandeisian political economy. It was imported. A lot of it was imported. A lot of it was homegrown, but a lot of it was also imported, like through the Mount Pelerin conversations in the 1930s. I mean, it's like the American Walter Lippmann repeatedly would come to these meetings carrying Brandeisian ideas, and he would share them. And so this is not an antique German concept. This is a concept of liberty, a conception of how you achieve liberty that goes back to 1776. In some ways, it goes back to the foundation of modern democracy in Britain in the early 17th century. The other thing is like, is this in any way unfair to the actors within this system? Absolutely not. Again, this is a way. It's a system that establishes. It protects people's fundamental property rights in all of their aspects in ways that allow us to speak freely and also do freely. Yeah. Speak in the political sphere freely and do freely in the economic sphere.
I think we're probably over time, so let me squeeze this in. Yeah. In competition, a lot of people like to talk about efficiency. There's a really, really good way to know if something's efficient or not. When you run it on your laptop, does the fan start running? Right? You know what I'm talking about. Yes. Some software, the fan starts running. Now Chrome, many laptops, you load up Chrome. I used to work for a competing web browser to Chrome. You load up Chrome, the fan starts running, and yet you're still using Chrome. Mm. And you look at the alternatives, and the fan doesn't start running. So this is what efficiency looks like and what innovation looks like. And the incumbents are guilty of horrific bloat.
So what you're saying is that Google is actually literally blowing hot air.
They're literally blowing hot air and creating carbon.
And Barry, to your liberty point, I mean, I would love it if companies would inhale this belief, and that their chief executives and their CFOs, their CTOs would be saying, hey, we need to be considering human rights, we need to be considering liberty, we need to be making our systems open so that the pie grows bigger and all this kind of stuff. And as I've said, the profit motive tends to work against that. But I'm thinking of some sort of way of explaining it to these large companies who weren't always large like that unless they were state monopolies, and saying, if you put a veil of ignorance in front of you and said, democratically elected parliaments here to protect human rights and property rights are going to impose these conditions, would you agree with that when you were two guys in a garage working on some software or something? And they'd probably say, yeah, because we need to grow. But for some reason, they don't see that, that veil of ignorance point when they're big. They're like, oh, you're just going to...
Or maybe they see it and they don't want a nascent competitor to eat their lunch.
Yes, yeah. Speaking of which, let's have lunch.
Yes, yeah.
Ein Beitrag der Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung.